Today on the Bloody Alphabet, it's letter N with Terry Nichols.
Terry Nichols with Timothy McVeigh were found guilty of the Oklahoma City bombing. The bombing occurred at Alfred P. Murray Federal Building on April 19, 1995. The incident caused the deaths of about 176 people. On the date that the bombing occurred, Nichols was hundreds of miles away at his home in Kansas. 2 days later, he voluntarily went into questioning at the Harrington Police Headquarters. He said that he heard on the news that he was a material witness. Terry's brother James was also a material witness, but all charges against him were later dropped. Just 2 hours into questioning, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Terry Nichols. On May 10, 1995, Nichols was formally charged with the bombing, and 3 months later, both Nichols and McVeigh were indicted by the federal grand jury. They were charged for conspiracy to use weapons of mass destruction and the 8 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of federal employees in the Murray building. He was sentenced to 161 consecutive life sentences. And that's the story of Terry Nichols. Today on the Bloody Alphabet, we're talking about letter O with Anatoly Onoprienko. He was also known as the Terminator or the Beast of Ukraine. At the age of 4, he lost his mother and he began getting taken care of by his grandparents and his aunt for a little while until he was put into an orphanage. He claims that this is what shaped his destiny. In 1989, after years of mental problems, he killed his first victim at the age of 30. And by serial killer standards, this is old. Over the next 5 years, he made up for lost time and killed 11 people. In 1995, he went on a killing spree, and in just 6 months, he murdered 43 people. In March of 1996, the police began to panic, and there was a huge manhunt launched to find him. In 1996, he was finally captured. He confessed to killing 52 people, and he claims that there was commands given to him by an inner voice. He was eventually found guilty and sentenced to death. However, Ukraine banned capital punishment. He then got sentenced to life in prison and died at the age of 54 due to heart failure. And that is the story of Anatoly Onoprienko. Today on the Bloody Alphabet, we're talking about letter P with Robert Pickton, also known as the Pig Farmer. He's a Canadian serial killer currently on trial for 6 counts of murder and suspected for at least 26 others. He was born into a family who were pig farmers for at least 3 generations. He gave up pig farming and sold his pigs to friends and neighbors. He had 2 siblings named David and Linda, and they inherited the family pig farm. However, this is where Pickton would later commit his murders. In 1997, Robert was charged with attempted murder of a prostitute named Wendy. He stabbed her, but she was able to get the weapon and stab him back and get away. The case was later dropped because the prosecutors felt that Wendy couldn't give an accurate testimony. On February 5, 2002, Pickton was arrested after a warrant for a firearm violation. When police showed up, they found personal belongings of a missing woman on the farm. This led to a second search warrant for the missing women investigation on his farm. As they searched the ground, they found remains of some of the victims. On December 6, 2007, a jury found Pickton guilty of 6 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was later transferred to the Quebec facility in June of 2018 and is still alive to this day. And that's the story of Robert Pickton. Working on letter R today with the person everyone's been waiting for, Richard Ramirez, also known as Richard Ramirez. He also goes by the Night Stalker. He's an American serial killer, rapist, and burglar who murdered at least 19 people in California between 1984 and 1985. At just 12 years old, he had a cousin who was a Vietnam War veteran who would show him pictures of Vietnamese women who he had allegedly raped, tortured, and killed. Ramirez then dropped out of high school and began breaking into homes in Los Angeles. He was briefly in prison for stealing a car at one point. In June of 1984, he committed his first known murder, raping, and stabbing of a 79-year-old widow. Most of his murders occurred in Los Angeles and took place during home invasions. Some of his victims survived, however, they were often sexually assaulted and beaten. They would end up being first-hand witnesses to help identify Richard Ramirez as the Night Stalker. His teeth helped play a big role in identifying him as well. Part 2 is already posted. Part 2 of Richard Ramirez in the Bloody Alphabet. Many people described him as having rotting teeth. In the summer of 1985, he ran off after being stopped in a stolen car. In the car, detectives found a business card from a dental office in Chinatown. They were then able to confirm it was Richard Ramirez due to his dental x-rays. Detectives staked out the dental office for days, and there was no sign of Ramirez. They finally gave up waiting at the dentist office. That same day that they gave up is when Ramirez would come in. On August 6, 1985, just 6 days after his last known murder, his name and photograph were released to the public. The very next day, a man in East Los Angeles saw him and notified police. Ramirez then tried to steal a car, however he was surrounded by a crowd and they began beating him until the police showed up. His trial began in early 1989, and in September he was convicted of 13 murders and various other crimes. And just 2 months later he was sentenced to death. It's believed that he committed other murders but was never charged for any additional crimes. While on death row, he was diagnosed with cancer and died in 2013. And that's the story of Richard Ramirez. Today on the Bloody Alphabet, we're working on letter S with Arthur Shawcross, also known as the Genesee River Killer. He grew up in Waterton, New York. At the age of 19, he enlisted in the army and fought in the Vietnam War. He would later confess to murdering and eating 2 young Vietnamese girls, although there was nothing to back this claim up. He went on to get married 4 different times, but his wives left him due to his violence and erratic behavior. In May of 1972, he murdered a 10-year-old boy named Jake Blake after luring him into the woods. Just 4 months later, he raped and killed an 8-year-old girl named Karen Ann Hill. He was arrested for these crimes and confessed to both murders, but later was able to obtain a plea bargain. He was sentenced to 25 years, but only served 15 before he was released on parole in March of 1987. Just a year later, he began murdering prostitutes, and he claimed 11 victims before he was captured less than 2 years later. He went on trial in November of 1990 and was sentenced to 250 years in prison. A few months later, he pled guilty for another murder, but was given a life sentence. He ended up dying on November 10th, 2008 due to cardiac arrest. And that's the story of Arthur Shawcross. Today on the Bloody Alphabet, we're talking about letter T with Otis Tool. He had a troubled childhood, and at the age of 14, he committed his first murder. He ran a salesman over with a car after the man propositioned him for sexual acts. In the mid-70s, he started a sexual and crime partnership with Henry Lee Lucas. This is when his petty crimes turned to murder. He got married in 1977, but his wife complained about the relationship he had with Lucas, and they soon separated. In 1981, after his mother's death, Tool claimed 9 victims in 6 different states. Once incarcerated, he and Lucas confessed to an additional 108 homicides. It's unclear of how many killings he and Lucas committed together. In 1984, he was convicted of setting a fire that killed a 64-year-old man. He was sentenced to death for this crime. It is also said that in 1981, he murdered Walsh's son. This is what would lead to the television show America's Most Wanted. He had a total of 2 death sentences and at least 4 life sentences. On September 15, 1996, Otis Tool died at the age of 49 due to liver failure. And that is the story of Otis Tool. Today on the Bloody Alphabet, we're talking about letter U with Jack Underweger, also known as an Australian serial killer who murdered several women. Growing up, he was abused and abandoned as a child, and most of his life he was around pimps and prostitutes. In his early teens, he turned to crime and was first arrested at 16 for assaulting a prostitute. He ended up murdering an 18-year-old sex worker. He went to prison for this, and while he was there, he became a writer. After he got out of prison, he eventually earned literary respect and went on to write an autobiography. He ended up appearing on talk shows and booking speaking engagements. He was trying to convince people that he was a transformed man. However, not everybody believed this. There was then a string of prostitute murders, and police went straight to Jack. He went on to give interviews to proclaim his innocence. However, in 1992, he was detained, and he was found guilty of 9 murders. Soon after the sentencing, he was found dead in his prison cell. And that is the story of Jack Underweger. Today on the Bloody Alphabet, we're talking about letter W with Eileen Wuernos. She had a very troubling childhood. Her father killed himself in prison for child molestation, and her mother abandoned her and her older brother. They were then raised by their alcoholic grandmother and violent grandfather. She was sexually assaulted, and at the age of 15, she gave birth to a little boy who was then adopted. As an adult, she was hitchhiking and engaging in sex work. Starting in the mid-1970s, she was going in and out of jail and was in multiple different relationships. However, in the late 1989, she would have murdered at least 6 men along Florida highways. Over the next few months, 5 more bodies would be found. Police were then able to track her down by fingerprints and palm prints left on crashed vehicles. During her trial, she stated that she killed these men in self-defense. On January 27, 1992, she was found guilty of first-degree murder and received the death penalty. She tried to plead guilty for the 5 other men she murdered, but ended up receiving a death sentence for each plea. She was executed by lethal injection on the morning of October 9, 2002. And that's the story of Eileen Wuernos. Today on the Bloody Alphabet, we're talking about letter Y with Graham Young. He was born on September 7th, 1947 to Fred and Bessie Young. However, his mother died 3 months after giving birth due to tuberculosis. Graham ended up staying with his Aunt Winnie, while his older sister Winifred stayed with their grandparents. He spent the first 2 years of his life with his aunt and then reunited with his father. His father got remarried in 1950. Graham showed signs of distress after being separated from his aunt and was described as becoming a peculiar child. When he was old enough to read, he favored books about murders, and specifically Dr. Crippen, who was an infamous poisoner. His interests included chemistry, forensic science, and toxicology. However, he had to learn about this stuff on his own time. At the age of 13, he was very knowledgeable on toxicology. He was able to convince a local chemist that he was 17 and he produced a dangerous quantity of poisons. This was when he put his knowledge of poisons to the test. Stay tuned for part 2. Graham Young's first victim was a fellow science student, Christopher Williams. He suffered an extended period of vomiting, cramps, and headaches due to Young administering cocktails of poisons to him. Williams survived because he ended up going home when he was sick, and Young couldn't poison him when he was home. This is when he ended up focusing on his own family. In 1961, Young's father suspected that Graham was harming the family with poisons. However, Graham denied the accusations. Graham's older sister Winifred was found poisoned, and again, Young's father was suspecting Graham. On April 21st, 1962, Molly Young, which is Graham's stepmother, ended up dying due to the poisoning. Graham was sent to a police psychiatrist after his chemistry teacher found poisons in his desk at school. In 1962, he was arrested, only 14 years old. He had admitted to poisoning his family and was sent to a maximum security hospital. Part 3 coming up next. While incarcerated, he continued to try and poison people. Doctors seemed oblivious to his continued fascination for poisoning. He was finally released on February 4th, 1971 due to him being cured. He got a job and shortly after began poisoning his coworkers by making them tea and coffee. About 70 employees said that they had severe cramping, dizziness, and vomiting. They thought that the water was contaminated. That was until a doctor found out about Young's toxicology knowledge. After Graham began asking him why he didn't think these people were being poisoned, the police were alerted and Young was finally arrested. He went to trial where he was charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of administering poison. He then received 4 life sentences. He ended up dying on August 1st, 1990 at the age of 42 due to heart failure. And that is the story of Graham Young. We're working with the last letter of the bloody alphabet today, which is letter Z with the Zodiac Killer. To this day, the Zodiac Killer has never been found, and due to this, I decided to color him in grayscale. On August 1st, 1969, the San Francisco Examiner, the Chronicle, and the Vallejo Times Herald each received an identical handwritten letter in an envelope without a return address. The letter read, "Dear Editor, I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman." The letter contained details of the Zodiac Killer's murder that only the killer could have known. The writer then went on to threaten further attacks if the letter wasn't printed on the front page of newspapers. After this, multiple letters were sent out, and the letters also contained one part of a 3-part cipher that he claimed contained his identity. The FBI and Bay Area police worked really hard to catch the killer. However, this didn't happen. What ended up happening was another letter got sent in. Part 2 coming next. The next letter that they received read, "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking," and within the letter, it described the murders in detail and taunted the police for not having been able to crack the code and catch him. A few days passed, and the cipher was finally cracked. It read, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." In 1969, the 4th known victim of the Zodiac Killer was a taxi driver named Paul Stine. Just 3 days after the murder, the San Francisco Chronicle received a letter claiming the crime. The letter went into detail of Stine's murder and was accompanied by a bloody scrap of his shirt, and at the end, the killer mused that he would next shoot out the tire of a school bus and pick off the kids as they come bouncing out. The Zodiac Killer continued to send letters with more ciphers and mocking the police to not be able to catch him. That was up until 1974 when the letters stopped. Part 3 coming next. Although the Zodiac Killer's letters stopped, the investigation was not over. At least 4 separate attacks have been attributed to the Zodiac Killer, and at least 5 other murders have been linked to him. Although he was never caught, witnesses saw a man leaving the scene of Paul Stine's murder, and with their descriptions, police were able to create a composite sketch of the killer. The mystery surrounding the Zodiac case continues to fascinate the public. It has inspired multiple movies and TV shows. And that is the story of the Zodiac Killer.